Welcome to The New Next, a podcast that addresses current events and how they will impact the future. Co-hosted by the inquisitive public speaking champion, Mike McVeigh, and energy, economics, and technology expert, Matt Jensen. Join us as we explore all things energy, economic, tech, and political, and how they will affect our future. So, Matt, we talked a little while ago about Generations, the book by Strauss and Howe, and talked a little bit about generational theory. I don't remember exactly what inspired some of that, but I mean, we're pretty inspiring people and we get inspired pretty easily. So, we do what we can. And
well, I think I sent you, I sent you the Fourth Turning, and you were like, oh, I didn't realize I had read another book by them.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, this is a great book. And you told me about the story of how you read it the first time. It would be interesting to hear that again.
Yeah. The first time I came across this was in 1997. I think that was a few years after it was written. If I remember correctly, it was written in 91.
Yeah, I think you're right.
My church, the pastor on Wednesday nights did kind of sometimes he would do a Bible study or whatever. But I guess I will say one thing to his credit is he was always pretty good on trends on both what was going on in the secular world as well as the church world and stuff. And I don't know if something was recommended to him, but we started talking about generations, and we went through this book by Strauss and Howe called Generations. And I was a senior in high school, and I had never really connected with our youth group. So I stayed with all the old people listening to, as we went through this book study and everything. And I wish I still had the notes. That would have been really interesting to look at. But one of the things that was talked about was specifically how they marked the generations of what they call the 13th generation, which we usually refer to as Generation X, and then the millennial generation, which amazingly still kept that name. In fact, I'm kind of wondering if they're the ones who came up with millennial as the name. And I also like the name that they have for people that are born after 2004, the Homeland generation. Yeah. And that seems to be even more prescient with 2001 with the towers and stuff, the 9/11 going down. Their whole literally anybody who was born after that time, their whole life has been under kind of a homeland security has come to prominence where I don't know if before 2011, or not 2011, 9/11, that anybody ever really knew what Homeland Security was, except for maybe a very, very select few people or government nerds or something. No, I'm going to give so yeah, we just kind of went through it, and it was interesting at the time, but, I was 18 getting ready for college and stuff. So I don't know how much I really paid attention. I just remember the first two lessons the most. But then I want to say it was it was 2015, October 2015. The class was being offered at work, and for supervisory credits, I took a class that was called Generations. And I think the guy must have had a companion guide to this or something that was written by somebody else, because a lot of the things he talked about were, I don't think he did a good study of the book necessarily, but it was one of our captains, and he did a good job of kind of talking about how different generations perceive things. He had an interesting exercise where he had everybody rate what was your favorite sports team when you were a kid, and some sports teams, because of the age group we had, they came in two different time periods. So if you said the Dallas Cowboys, the 70s, if you were a kid in the 70s, it was a different Dallas Cowboys than if you were a kid in the 90s. So that was kind of an interesting thing in the view of what the Cowboys were to both of those groups. Specifically, it was more of a workshop. So I think we only spent 1 day total, and there were some. At the time, I didn't even realize it was the same book. It only came back after when we actually started talking about it. I was like, oh, wow, that is the same book. And then after reading it, I can confirm that both in 1997 and in 2015, those were indeed the same book that I read over the summer.
Cool. So kind of, in talking about this, both you and I thought it would be interesting for us to kind of talk about cycle theory and generations in the fourth turning on this podcast.
Yeah.
It's, my experience, like I can't remember when I necessarily came across this the first time. So, but the fourth turning, which is the follow-up to Generations, is probably one of my favorite books ever, and it's just a little bit shorter than this.
A little bit, maybe a lot.
Cycle theory too is something that I've always talked a lot about with certain people and observed. So it's like, this hasn't been necessarily my only influence with it, but it's been something that I've felt, being a trained economist and, financial economist. I've thought a lot about the differences in generations and how that manifests in different aspects in society. This was something that we talked a lot about too when I studied overseas, did my master's degree in Europe. It was like, I think a kind of like a little bit different perspective, because the Netherlands, for instance, they have basically kind of like an economic bureau that does a lot of the central planning and advisory, but I feel like they have a lot more influence than we do here, or the similar people do here, kind of on how policy goes out and stuff. But when I was going to school there too, like we talked a lot about, I would say, cycle theory and generational theory too, and how demographics changing in societies, and also basically people heading into different life stages based on the life events that they've occurred as the collective generation would, cause or affect certain historical or geopolitical patterns in the future. So it was pretty cool that I found out that, you read this too. Like, I feel that we've kind of like talked a lot about this in different capacities, from, the economic capacity, but also religion and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like one of the most, or probably one of the most important theories, if you're going to do any sort of kind of economic or sociological analysis, in my opinion. So
yeah, it's definitely a good, I'd say a key for kind of a very general understanding of how thoughts are different and stuff. And I'm just doing some side research while we're talking. And part of the reason why this book even got written was Strauss had written a lot about the Vietnam War from the GI generation, the 1901 to 1924 born people, whereas Howe had written a lot about the Vietnam War based off of Baby Boomer, the 1943 to 1960, and how how differently those two generations looked at the exact same events. And now I will give one caveat at the very beginning. I think the book does try to make everything fit sometimes when it doesn't always fit. And even if you do a breakdown of some of the stuff, they mention some of this in the book. So I don't want to put like they didn't consider it, but there is right. Like I said, it's more of kind of a key that helps. And if you've ever dealt a lot with keys, like the old fashion that you put in a door, because I just realized that we now have keys that you don't ever have to. Over time, the key can get worn down, or the lock can change shape a little bit over time and stuff, where it's not as great of a fit as when they first were made stuff. But the idea behind it, and I think specifically the, dare I say, prophetic nature of what came out of what they said in 1991 would happen over the next 30 to 40 years, and then what exactly has happened over that 30 to 40 years. And they, even in their fourth turning, I haven't read that yet. It's on my next book to read, but that was written in 97, and still the 23 years, 25 years that have happened since then, those are things that you can definitely tell that their pattern does follow a system that works. They don't ever give specific events, so I want to make sure that that's when they talk about the future stuff. But it's some of the things they've alluded to. Yeah, I mean, they did say that there was probably going to be a good chance that a celebrity personality type person would be the president of the United States around the time that Trump got elected. They mentioned somewhere. Now, it's kind of weird how they write it, but they're specific, but also vague at the same time. They say something somewhere between 2013 and 2022. There's going to be some kind of world catastrophe that's going to affect everybody. But they actually get a little bit more specific and say it's probably going to be closer to 2018, 2019. And of course, in 2020, the pandemic happened. COVID pandemic, Corona.
Didn't they say it was going to be a virus, though?
They said I think they said the chances were most likely to be a virus. I mean, because they don't want to be like Nostradamus or something where everybody's going to hold them to stuff. That wasn't their goal. It was just to say, based on the patterns that we're seeing, unless something drastically changes, and I think this is where their method shows a lot of smart preparing. I mean, one of the things I really do like about it, the four phase cycle of prophet, nomad, hero, artist, and that it's on a repeat cycle. It does help kind of explain over an 80-year period. Generally, it'll vary from time to time, but it will show how close and how far each generation is to each other. But then over the spread of the beginning of one generation, the prophet generation, at the end of the upcoming artist generation, which is approximately 80 years, how far away they are from each other. Yeah. And I mean, it's hard to believe that, we're about to start or we're finishing the Homeland generation. Generation Z we're right at the end of that right now. And as far as when they're born. And so based on their method, it's not when you're born that it matters. It's when you reach kind of an adult stage of adulthood. So around being 40 years old. And you and I are technically in two different generations based on how they have it. But we're very close. So we share, I'm sure that's one thing I kind of wish they would have talked about a little bit more, but me being part of Generation X and their terminology, and you being part of the millennial generation, even though we're only like 3 years apart or something, or 5 years or 20 years, I don't know. We're pretty distant. But yeah, I really like how when we use terms like history repeats itself and things like that, it's not that history repeats itself as much as the same kinds of thinking get repeated, because we think that like, oh, hey, did you guys realize 80 years ago there was this idea and it was successful for a while? And we forget that there was the 60 years in between that, they really got the snot beaten out of it until they go into the next version, and the next version, next version. So I do think there is a lot of consistency on that part. I do feel like they force some years sometimes, but for the America version, because they span it from 1433 until like 2043 is what the book I think says on the list.
1584 to 2069.
Yeah, so I was off by 20 years or so. It's okay. 20 is a good number.
That's a long time, and this book is like Generations is a great book, but it's also filled with information.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people might like the fourth turning better because it's more, I feel like, condensed and stuff. But 1584 to 2069 or 2069, they basically go through and talk about how each of these, 20 to 30 year generational blocks related to each other and how the effects of one caused each other. I've thought about recently the parental, whether or not there's a cycle based on kind of these generational parental cycles,
Mm-hmm.
how people parent in a certain way and how that causes children to be a certain way or be affected by, the traumas experienced by the parents or something like that. And how, it just kind of naturally fulfills itself because, we're just not really necessarily aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of one of the things one of my professors, and I think I've mentioned it before, but he was taking not this book, but he was just using generations as a whole and saying that when you're the first generation to do something, kind of the aspects of that, then the second generation, and then the third generation. And we were specifically talking about from the Hebrew Bible, where you have Abraham who sets off to kind of start this new faith. And that he, in the biblical narrative, he makes a lot of mistakes in discovering what's considered to be right and wrong. And then you have Isaac, who's of the second generation. And Isaac is still held very highly, among the Jewish people specifically, but even Christians probably not to the same extent. But there's not really as much known about Isaac unless it's in direct reference to Abraham or it's in direct reference to his son. And it's kind of like a hidden generation of sorts that he's still a part of the faith. He still gets listed, but we don't really know as much about him. We know about the people around him more than we know about him. And then you have the third generation, which is Jacob. And Jacob rebels a little bit from his father and his grandfather's faith until he gets humbled. And then he becomes a different type of ambassador. And then finally, the fourth generation is Joseph, even though it's just really funny because Joseph is the least important son of Jacob, if you look at it from other perspectives, but from the perspective of the Hebrew, the Jewish people giving their identity. But from the biblical perspective, Joseph now becomes this really important person, and almost all the things that he does when he's in power go against what Abraham first brought out on faith and stuff. And it's just an interesting, and he kind of used that same kind of cycle thing of talking about like how his grandfather was a preacher and was the boldest of made lots of mistakes, but did it boldly. And then his dad, who got positions of power, but his dad always was known by what his father did or what his son did, other people in his life as opposed to him. And then my professor, he talked about how he kind of has this rebellious streak, kind of used that as an example. And I thought that was kind of cool. And I feel like this is something that definitely fits in to the generations type mindset of, and now his son, like, of course, wow, goodness, his son's in his 30s now, or early 30s, late 20s. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm old because I remember when he was born. But just kind of the same kind of cycle that I specifically enjoyed the part of the book where they're talking about coming upon the Revolutionary War. And you have these things that have happened, but the difference between George Washington's approach as opposed to John Adams' approach, as opposed to Alexander Hamilton, where they're all within this kind of 20-year age range. Ultimately, like Washington's at the very end of his generation. I think that was the Liberty generation. No, that can't be right. The Awakening generation. John Adams is kind of in the middle with this Liberty generation. And then you have Alexander Hamilton, which is from the Republican generation. And all three of them are part of the same party, but they completely approach what we call the Revolutionary War in such different perspectives. Now, not all that's from the book, but having done my own studies on each of those those two presidents and Alexander Hamilton, and I think this is something that stayed true to what the generations theory has said, that the way that each of them approached it, what was going on in the world, that got them to the idea of what really mattered. Whereas Washington wanted to be he wanted just to be accepted by the British military. And then he ends up becoming the general. He gets kicked out of the British military because he's too, he's too lax. He doesn't follow to the code strict enough. I mean, that's some of the reasons why he legitimately got kicked out. And then you have Alexander Hamilton, which believes that the only way that you can ever be considered great if you're coming from nothing is to be a war hero. Being dead is being better than being alive. And yeah. And then you have John Adams, who more than those other two combined was really one of the sparks to us being in a revolutionary war. But all three of them being on the same side, yet they never got along with each other. Washington and Hamilton got along better than Adams did with either of them. And what's also interesting about that is Thomas Jefferson is actually closer to Hamilton, like on this generation range. And Adams, who was diametrically opposed politically, actually got along better with Jefferson in old age than he had ever gotten along with Washington or Hamilton.
Yeah, that's interesting.
There's a lot of good nuggets, and my love of history, it definitely makes me want to go back and look through some of those time periods and see how well it matches up. But like I said, it's not an exact. I don't want anybody to thinking like this is going to tell you the future, but it does give a really good blueprint of basically how things have happened in the past, and does a really good job of explaining the past 20, 25 years despite lack of knowledge.
I think like a lot of things, basically the history repeats itself, right? Like we talked about, It's just kind of like a different perspective, and understanding and studying and analyzing history, like historical events in the context of the history of this historical, the full kind of canvas landscape of what they were going on at the time, I think is important. And when you have a framework like this that Strauss and Howe put together that allows you to kind of like look through this framework, it allows you, I think, to really understand world events as they occur right now in that historical cycle context. And a lot of times it's just like, you're like, well, this is going to happen. And then they're like, how do you know that's going to happen? And it's because it happened like the last 6 times,
Right.
So, I like their generational theory. I find it really interesting. So it has, kind of like those 2 primary pillars, which are the turnings and the archetypes. So the turnings is basically like a 4-stage cycle of, kind of like the cycle turning over and recycling again.
Right.
So that would be, 80 to 90 years. And that's the high, which occurs after a crisis, an awakening, which is the second turning, where institutions are attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy, the unraveling, where it's basically the opposite of the high. Institutions are weak and distrusted, and then the crisis, which is the fourth turning, which is based on Strauss and Howe generational theory. That's the period that we've been in since, what was it, like 2008 or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, that's basically a crisis, and then it cycles back over to a high and kind of like goes through this natural progression. On the archetypes, like you talked about a little bit earlier, you have the prophet who entered childhood during the high, the nomad who entered childhood during awakening, the hero of the civic generation who entered childhood during unraveling, and the artist who entered childhood after a crisis. So as millennials, and grouping you in there, I think we're grouped in as the hero generation because we entered childhood when it was starting to unravel, and we're kind of entering adulthood during a crisis stage.
Yeah. I will say it's weird because from other generational books, not necessarily this one, or the things that come out with. Have you ever read that list from the college? They give out something like every year of how incoming freshmen, what they know or don't know. And every year it's basically embarrassing the older you get. Like, wait, they don't know this. And being right on the edge of both generations, it's weird because I feel like I really do identify with both generations for the most part, at least all the negative stuff from both generations. There's a group, they made it as a joke called the X-Millennials, which are people who were born from 1978 to 1982, 1983-ish, and that we all identify buying an Apple computer and playing Oregon Trail. And that ultimately we all believe we're going to die of dysentery and they call it the X-Millennial group because it's like a little mini generation in between, because there are things unique to that 5-year period that possibly no other 5-year period has ever had. And you might not have been exactly born in that year, but it's just the way of how technology literally came out while we were born. And so we were the first ones to really mess with the technology at a young age. But also, and I would even say early millennials versus like anything from 1986 onward. It feels like there's a difference on how education was done, at least from what the people I've talked about. What year were you born? Now that I'm going to okay, good. Yeah. 84, 1978 to 84. Yeah. I was born in 79, and there's just the way computers were addressed in kind of our time frame. And then it took a few years after that. Then it's like everybody all of a sudden started learning with computers, but we were literally the test subjects on what it was like for a kid to even touch a computer, because they're so small now, and we can fit multiple of them in a room. I think it
play so much online backgammon.
We're the ones that grew up with. I know Atari was already out, but Nintendo and Sega really came out during our time. Like, I've never really thought about it greatly, but Mario probably means more to us in our kind of little sub generation than about any other group, because Mario, when we were old enough to finally play games, Mario Brothers was out, and then Super Mario Brothers was the identifying game, and Mario's still going on strong 35 years later, 40 years later. So it's but I definitely feel the unraveling. I know the things that get mentioned the most are, we think of September 11th and the war on terror, but we also, you and I grew up during the war on drugs. We grew up with, the Oklahoma City bombing, Waco, the first towers attack and stuff. We weren't far removed from the idea that there was still a Cold War going on when we were in school. And we still, I'd say we as a whole, especially the sub generation. I wish this is where I wish they would have talked more about, but we still think of Russians somewhat from the Cold War version of Russia, because there was movies that kept on implementing it, whether it was, now I can't even think of it. It's the first R-rated movie ever. The group of teenagers who fight Russia. Red Dawn. Yeah, Red Dawn. First R-rated movie, by the way. That actually had the category, or PG-13, first PG-13 movie, excuse me. And then you have Ruskies, which was a Disney movie. And so, like, when you talking earlier about talking about like calling your friends Russian, even though you didn't know it, but then there's another movie that John Travolta and Kelly Preston were in. I think it was like 1988 or 1989, where they recruit John Travolta and his best friend to try to help Americanize this village in Russia, so that way they can infiltrate America. It's actually where they met each other, and they started kind of before they got married and stuff. So that's kind of a little interesting side note. And it's like all these movies like, hey, Russia's not that bad. And then all of a sudden the Cold War, the thing falls. And I mean, people that are born in the 90s really don't get the hostility towards Russia from the 80s and stuff. I mean, I'm sure before the 80s as well, but like they didn't get all the, Ivan Drago from Rocky IV. Also, which is kind of cool. When I mentioned before that I might have just mentioned it to you, but there's a lady and her son who are watching these Russian stereotypes on TV, and they said, and he's like, I almost kind of feel for Rocky, and she's like, no, if you were a true Russian, you would have felt proud about this movie because you knew that the greatest boxer ever was Ivan Drago, and he was Russian. Like even in the fictionalized universe, like you were cheering for him because he's Russian. And like that was the whole idea of USA, I joke about that sometimes, the whole Homer Simpson kind of idea that, hey, we're America, we kick your butt. It comes from this hostility in the 80s. I mean, that's just our little sub-generation, not to mention all the things that are encompassing around us. I feel like one of the things, this is where I think you and I definitely start splitting. I feel like I'm a much more cynical person. And I think the Generation X has bled into my blood, and I feel like I'm a lot more cynical than you are, or you just hide it so much better than me. Because one of the things.
What ways, Mike?
I don't know. I think like the world is always just like we're screwed if we do, we're screwed if we don't. Even if I think back some of our episodes that we've recorded already, I'm kind of like, what hope is there? And you're like, yeah, but you never know. There's still hope. And I'm like, but how? We're killing ourselves.
Yeah.
If only Strauss.
The worst. Well, like talking about these turnings, right? You go through a crisis and then you go to a high. Like I kind of feel that that's pretty relational to most elements in life. So, like a good life where you experience all aspects of it, its highs and lows, and usually the best moments come after either a crisis or a perceived crisis.
Right. I guess I look at it a little bit like using those archetypes of prophet, nomad, hero, and artist. I feel like a nomad. Like I definitely identify more with that than as a hero. Anti-hero maybe. But I feel like the words of the prophet get lost in my generation. Yeah. And these heroes and stuff, I was like, but you don't understand. You don't know what we've gone through. And I definitely feel like my daughter, who was born 2006, that she definitely fits that artist type, just of how she looks at the world and stuff. And and I know it's not meant artist like literally, but I definitely feel that vibe more of just how she thinks about the world. It seems to be a lot more in that kind of adaptive way. I feel a lot more reactive. I feel like you are probably ultimate millennial in the most positive way ever. Like you just take whatever crisis comes your way. And I'm not saying you don't have a hard life sometimes, but it seems like looking on the outside in that you just kind of take what's handed to you and you're like, okay, this is what's handed to me. Let's go.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure if everybody would agree with that, but
that's okay. Not everybody's right. Yeah. Including myself sometimes, allegedly.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I like listening to this. I kind of feel like I had more of a nomad upbringing, but I feel, more in the elder millennial part, like you're talking about.
Yeah. And when was your parents born? The youngest parent. What year were they born?
54.
Okay. So right around. Yeah, that's one thing that's a little bit interesting as well. Because
older parents.
Yeah, but not by that much. My parents were born, and Brenda's parents, they were actually born 50, 51, 52, and 53. Which I thought was always kind of funny, but the fact that we're both on the border, but we were all born from parents of the baby boom, and then except in extreme, I mean, not that it couldn't happen, but most of our kids are generally born like a full generation apart, years wise and stuff. I mean, your oldest is, I'm not going to get into their age so people don't stalk you too much, but they seem to be very young. And it's like, oh goodness. Not just how much time has passed, but how much time has passed. It's how they view the world, because, they don't know the world of, telephones being something that aren't mobile kind of thing. And I will say that's one of the things I do have fun with at work is there's enough people around me that there's still a few people that are in the boomer age group, but we have a lot of millennials, and soon we're going to have some, Homelanders or Generation Zs that will be starting to work because they're going to be 18 within the next couple of years. Wow. And it's just interesting heck, I mean, even at improv, the difference between someone who is freshly from 18 to 21 and the age group of like 28, 29, just how much difference it feels, but they still have a more concentrated thing than I do with them. That's why I feel so old and ancient. One thing I do like about this book, and I forgot about it until we were talking, but they said they don't like calling it the baby boomers. They just like calling them the boomers. Yeah. Though I think I want to say there was a remark that was made in the book that said that, but in a sense they still act like babies. So maybe baby boom is appropriate. Is that just my imagination, or was that in the book? Yeah. And it just seemed like such a Howe thing to say. Because he's like, yeah, we're babies, that's that's the whole problem. But then when I think about that, like, so Meredith and her group and stuff are, in this artist generation. So that means they're going to be giving birth to the ones who are generally of whatever the next baby boomers are going to be, basically. And I don't know. It's just kind of fun. I like looking back through. There's a thing on Wikipedia if you want to see a breakdown, and it's the most honest breakdown of the book than most of the other ones I've seen, because most of them they add their versions of it into it. But
can you send a link in the chat?
Yeah. It's the Strauss-Howe generational theory. For those, if you just look it up on Wikipedia, but they actually break it down the way that Strauss and Howe break it down. And I keep on looking at the second turning each time. It always seems to be like a very negative group. No, the kind of like the Liberty Like the nomad group. It's always like Liberty's the nicest one that they have, but then you have the Gilded generation, the Lost generation, the 13th generation, or the X generation. It's always these like kind of negative terms of American history. And then you have, Matt's, I'm going to say that you're still on that, you're closer to millennial, but you're the Arthurian generation. You're the Elizabethan generation. You're the glorious generation. The Republican generation. Then you're a blank generation because that's how awesome you are. You don't even have to. You're the GI generation, considered like the greatest generation ever. And then you're the millennials. And then the fourth generation on each one. It's also not so great. It's kind of like, yeah, we're humanist, parliamentary, compromise. Oh, sorry, enlightenment. That one's kind of cool. But the compromise generation, the progressive generation, the silent generation, and now the homeland generation. It's like you understand why you have the groups that come out before that.
Yeah, pretty interesting. They would walk through the presidents came with these different.
Mm-hmm.
That was interesting too. Like the Gilded generation, I think, had 6 or 7 presidents out of it, and that's when you're basically attacking the established institutional order. Like you're basically against the man, I guess. So
Sure.
And anti-institutional. Not you personally, considering that
Yeah.
you work for government, but your generation. So it's interesting to see how this all plays out. Like I think you'd see if you look through this generational theory, you can really see why a lot of younger millennials and stuff, the Zoomers or whatever, identify as progressives.
So you want to hear an interesting fact that this is actually really true and really messed up at the same time. So one of the predictions they did make, I don't know, it might not have been in the books, but it was in one of the other things. They said that there was never going to be a president of the United States elected from the silent generation. And until 2020, there never was.
Yeah.
Not by much, technically by like the last year of it. But still, Biden is the first president from the silent generation. And that says a lot.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, he was 70 or 68 or something, I think, when he got elected.
Yeah.
And I watched an interview with Howe, because I think Strauss is dead, right? Yeah, he died in 2013, I believe.
But yeah, I watched an interview with Howe talking about Biden being president, and he made some good points about how he's like the stereotypical silent generation, like a guy that really pushes for consensus, wants, comes out of this place of personal sacrifice and grew up overprotected by adults.
Like the group we're making right now.
Yeah, so, like he was saying, is just kind of, he fits the perfect example of what you would expect a silent generation president to be like.
Yeah.
And it, I think, kind of gives a little bit perspective of why he was elected, right?
Yeah. And what's funny is if he would have been born 42 days later, he would have technically been a boomer. So you can definitely feel, I mean, you can also see the vibes from that boom, the earlier booms and stuff.
Yeah.
It's a really, it would be interesting to look back, and I never did do this, of how many presidents came from the compromise and the progressive generations. Because, in fact, I'm going to look that up right now because I am one of those people. So, 67 to 91. Okay, so interestingly, that actually is very interesting. So the very first fourth turning generations, which would have been 1767 to 1791, we actually had 5 presidents elected from that, and 3 of them are fairly well known. One of them is really well known, is actually on money, Andrew Jackson. But John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, those are the 3 famous ones. And then you have William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, who are the other ones. From the progressive generation, I think we had a lot of presidents, but they were all the ones like the bearded no-names. 1843 to 1859. Let's see, we have... Nope, that was wrong on that part. Okay. Interesting. We had one of our greatest presidents in that time period. 2 of them, actually. 3 of them. So we had William McKinley, who's okay. Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson were all born in that time frame. Then also Warren G. Harding. Is that right? Yeah. Wow, that was a long generation. Oh, it might help if I look at it right. 1859. Nope, I'm looking right. Okay, so Warren G. Harding was not, but then it went back to... Yeah, okay, so Warren G. Harding broke the spell, but we had 6 presidents. So it is kind of interesting that the silent generation specifically did not have any president until Biden.
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting. Good books, and I think we should really read Fourth Turning next and have a talk about that, because we're talking about the period that we're in right now, where it's just kind of a mass crisis. A lot of the institutions that were built in kind of the last cycle are basically becoming, I don't know, broken's the word, but not fitting towards the current need for people these days. So, with this millennial generation being the hero civic generation, this is really the period as we come of age that historically the civic generation has basically rebuilt these institutions after they failed. And, we talk a lot about kind of geopolitical events, the Ukraine, Russia situation and stuff like that. But part of this is we're seeing the unraveling of that neoliberal world order that was created post World War II. That is kind of a outcome left over from the last crisis of the last fourth turning.
Right.
So, it's pretty interesting times that we're living in right now, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's a generational thing.
Yeah, totally. Generation. So if you want to check this book out, maybe the Fourth Turning might be a little bit more achievable for people right away. Like the Generation book is about 500 pages. And if you got the audiobook, it would be 22 or 24 hours.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. It reads similar to a history book from
history class,
like a generalized American history book almost. Like there's a lot of good nuggets. It's just that they're covered up in boredom. It's written. It's not greatly well. It's not well written, but it's easily written. So you don't have to have a super high reading knowledge to be able to understand what's going on, which is something I actually kind of like. It's a lower level, but it's not written well in the sense of where it's captivating and you remember specifics as easily. That's probably one of the biggest negatives I would give to the book, as far as having read a lot of books over the past few years, the fact that I can't think of anything specifically notable from this book that stands out, that kind of, and I can say almost every book I've read, I could give you something.
It basically like took this theory and then I feel just kind of like went through the different generations and we're like, this person was there and that, and with the fourth turning, the follow up to this, I feel it is a lot less like that.
Okay.
It's a better read, and the graphs in the book also I feel are a lot better to kind of demonstrate some of the theories that they're talking about. So that's, you know, both on focusing on more of a time relevant thing. I think it's just a better book. So
our next book study will be on the fourth turning. Yeah. So listeners will probably have already read it by the time you hear this podcast, but go ahead and check it out. And I think most libraries do have it.
That's also on.
Yeah, it's on. Well, if you're one of the people like me and you're nomadic and you're book buying, but if you want to do your civic responsibility, go ahead and buy it on Amazon. I wouldn't be surprised if it's in most bookstores still, honestly. Generations, that is. Fourth turning might be more limited, but I think it was on Hoopla, which is kind of cool.
Fourth turning, I think, is a lot more popular. It's like
you civic like people.
Generations is more of an academic book, history book, and the fourth turning. So Generations was written in 91, and the fourth turning in 97 for publishing dates. So one
was written for me when I was in 7th grade. The other was written when I was a senior in high school. So what can you say?
Well, we'll read the fourth turning, and then we'll come back and maybe talk about some more, I'd say, concrete theoretical elements and how they relate in current events that we're going through right now.
Definitely. If you would like to learn more about the New Next podcast, find us at thenewnextpodcast.com, where you can suggest a topic you would like for us to cover. If you enjoyed what you heard, share the podcast, tell a friend about it, or rate us with 5 stars.